Aloha! It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Puna Strong Virtual Resource Fair. As we build back Puna better from the 2018 eruption, the pandemic, and everything else that comes our way, I ask you to think about what makes Puna strong. To me, what makes Puna strong is its resilience and its diversity. And it's that diversity, I think, that has made us so much stronger. So I ask you to take the opportunity, listen to the resources that are out there, take advantage of those resources for not just you, but your friends and family, to help them not just get by, but to thrive. And so I want to thank our Equality High and other resources that put this resource fair together so that we can all be Puna strong. We can all be Hawaii strong. Enjoy the resource fair. Take care and aloha.
Okay. Hi, my name is Vali Hawkins-Mitchell, and I'm delighted to be a participant in the Puna Strong Virtual Resource Fair. I work on Oahu, and information is available about me if you're interested, but more importantly, I want to give you information that might be helpful to you. The topic today that I'm going to share with you is about disaster. Disaster 101, I call it. Because even though we live in paradise and everyone on the mainland thinks we're so lucky and that we're on the beach selling puka shells every single day, we know that living in Hawaii, living on whatever island you're on, has stress, and that we've been living through the disasters and more disasters than a lot of people on the mainland. We've had volcanoes, we've had COVID, and then life itself can be a challenge with work, with employment, and families. I've responded to a lot of national and international disasters. I'm a trauma specialist, and I'm one of the co-owners of Employee Assistance of the Pacific, and we respond to over 200 companies in the state of Hawaii who have individual and collective problems and disasters. I've responded to the World Trade Center, Katrina, Samoan tsunamis. I've been boots on the ground in a lot of disasters. And what I've learned that I can share with you is that most disasters have a fairly predictable path. There's a beginning of the disaster, there's the middle of the disaster, and then there's the end of the disaster. The beginning is a surprise and it's awful. The middle is confusing and difficult. And the end is about restoration and getting back to or forward to a new model after the disaster. But what's different about COVID and about living in where volcanoes are erupting is that it's a marathon, not a sprint. There isn't a clear beginning, middle, and end, especially to COVID. We see the end and then it changes, or the rules change, or the idea of are vaccines good? Which one should you get? Should you not? What you do? When do you wear a mask? The tourism is opening, it's closing. You can go back to work. No, you can't. And so that sense of beginning and middle end hasn't existed for quite some time here in Hawaii. So when you think of a definition of a disaster, the words come to mind. It's an unfortunate event, it's a sudden disruption, it's natural, it's man-made, it's catastrophic. But the way to survive and have resilience in a disaster is to do what I call know your zeros to tens. 0 meaning small, 10 meaning catastrophic or large. One man's disaster is another man's regular day, or what I call a Tuesday. So what may be a 10 for one person may be a 3 for someone else. What's a 1 for someone may be a catastrophic event for others. And so if you know your own 10s to zeros, you know what you're dealing with, then communicating what you need, or to work with another person or be in the presence of someone else that's experiencing something very different, allows you to communicate your level of need, your level of experience. Right now, there's such rapid fire communications with social media, Instagram, and so forth, that there's a sense of, I don't know what you're feeling or what I'm feeling, and are we the same? We're in the same disaster, but experiencing completely different things. A great example of this is when I've responded to tornadoes and someone loses their house in the tornado and the neighbor next door has lost nothing. Does that mean they're not affected? No, it just means they've had a very different experience. Every disaster has aftershocks, whether it's earthquake or a volcano or COVID. And what that means is it's not a steady line from the beginning to the middle to the end. There's lots of variations in between that can affect you, that can affect people around you, that can affect people in your family or your work group completely differently than you. So understand that a disaster is not a solid something that you can respond to. It's a something that changes and rearranges itself on a constant basis. I kind of think of it as almost a living entity, that a disaster has its own force, its own rhythm, its own process. And if you're aware of a disaster as having this kind of amorphous, changing shape all of the time, you can respond to it with resiliency by knowing your own reaction to it, whether you're at a 0 or a 5 or a 10 from day to day. Because every change in the world creates this process that humans go through called the grief cycle. Most of us are familiar with the grief cycle when it comes to the death of a loved one. We have denial, we have some anger, we go through depression and bargaining. Those are familiar stages that people are familiar with. But it doesn't take a death to have the grief cycle. For example, you're going to the mall to go shopping and you think you're going to get a parking place close up. Well, that's denial. But you go anyway. And then you try to find a spot, you bargain for that spot up close, and there's a motorcycle there or a smart car, and you get angry and you get depressed and you get like frustrated because you have to park all the way at the other side of the parking lot. But then again, you get out of your car, you go and you shop anyway, you've accepted the situation. But you've gone through that process of beginning and middle and end with something as mundane as getting a parking spot or losing your car keys. Where are my keys? I can't find them. I always put them there. Well, did you take my car keys? Where are the car keys? Oh, there they are. So we go through a lot of these on a daily basis. Again, the difference is that with COVID, volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, all of these processes that come and go, we may have several conflicting experiences with that curve of change from beginning to middle and end. And yours might be a mess. Yours might be simple. I got it. I'm on top of it. Yours might be really messy. That's also a normal and reasonable part of the process. Because some people might be impacted differently by a disaster. You know, we've talked about, I mean, I've mentioned about the 0 to 10, but even people who have a similar experience, if they've had abuse or trauma, a history of illness, they're combat military veterans, they have addiction, or a recent loss of a loved one, may have a different response to the exact same thing that you're experiencing. And today, my normal list is on the one side, but today I'd add the unemployment issues, financial changes, kids in school. Are they going to school? Are they not going to school? Are they going online? Separations because of travel. You haven't seen, your auntie for a year and a half. If you had prior issues before COVID, before volcanoes, before something happened in your world, and then returning to whatever normal is. What does normal mean now? The joke is that normal is just a setting on a washing machine. There is no real normal. It's what's your normal. Where do you want to be? Where are you now? Where are you headed? What we've discovered a lot now when we've done exploration of what's going on in Hawaii is people are fighting what's called emotional erosion of pandemic fatigue. What that means is we're getting tired. We're getting fed up. We're getting tired of the whole thing, of the starts and the stops and what's new today and what are the rules tomorrow. And I don't know. And I just figured out the rules. And as soon as I figured out the rules change. So all the factors of best disaster management, the practices for managing a disaster remain consistent no matter what the disaster is, no matter how big the disaster is or how small it is. Increasing your resiliency and finding sustainable self-care practices is what allows people to get from the beginning through the middle and to the end back to restoration. So I'm going to be talking about increasing your resiliency and what are sustainable self-care practices. The way to approach pandemic fatigue and actually any disaster, death, trauma, illness is an issue called bounded optimism. This was developed by a Vietnam prisoner named Admiral James Stockdale, and it's become named the Stockdale Paradox, which is he was a prisoner in Vietnam, prisoner of war, and it was his job to encourage his troops through this very difficult situation. And he found that there were a group of people that were super positive, we're going to get through this by Christmas. And those people didn't do as well in the long haul as people who looked at the reality of the situation and adjusted to it from moment to moment, knowing it might take longer than their hopeful idea of Christmas. And what they did was they tempered the reality of how awful it was with hope and inspiration, but it was reality-based. And that was the paradox between things are great and things are horrible, is let's stay in the middle with bounded optimism, which we hope for the best, but we're aware of what's going on in the moment. So practicing bounded optimism is finding a middle ground between that joyful Pollyanna of everything's going to be fine, the sun will come out tomorrow, and being, Eeyore, it's like, this is horrible, and I'm not happy. So the middle place is where resiliency happens. It's more flexible. If you move to the left or to the right, your thinking becomes rigid. And rigid thinking is what throws people into what I call the rabbit holes. And I'll talk to that later. But the rigidity of thinking of either we're fine or we're horrible moves people into these fundamentalist positions where there's no flexibility if something changes. You want to be fluid. You want to be able to be changeable inside whatever condition you're in. Because resiliency, and I'm going to look at that a little bit more closely right now, is not something that falls on your head magically. Resiliency is a learned skill, a learned behavior. It's your custom designed survival style and defense against stress. It's what you develop over time to be a survivor, to understand how to deal with changes, how to move, how to be fluid, whatever's coming through at the moment. If your resiliency is strong, then whatever comes, you have that ability to ride that wave, to move through and not be knocked out. What resiliency is not a bounce back magical contest of happy, 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 joy, joy, joy. Resiliency is a moving, flexible process. That means you feel what's going on, you know what's going on, you feel the pain, you feel the anguish, but you don't drag yourself into victimhood. You don't move along the line to Eeyore, and you don't try to push the goal into happy, happy, joy, joy. It's not a false happiness. It's this is what I'm dealing with. This is how I'm going to deal with this. And this is what I'm doing to deal with the moment. It's not always comfortable, but resiliency is a management tool to get you through whatever happens in life, whether it's a 2 or a 10 of disasters. Resiliency is a strong aspect of self-care. And in a disaster, self-care is not a recreational tree. It's the medicine. It's the way to survive. And it's not rocket science. It's not difficult. But self-care and resiliency are the tools you need to deal with whatever is going on in your life, not just this moment, for the long haul. So one of the things I've been teaching regularly to our companies and privately is the idea of what is extreme self-care. The difference between regular self-care and extreme self-care during a disaster is taking the long view. There's the beginning, the middle, and the end will come. The change will occur. The earthquake comes and the earthquake ends, and then the rebuilding happens. So there's this process, which is a long view, more like a marathon than a sprint. But the long view is you want to develop a self-care practice that's sustainable over time, that's consistent and builds on resiliency, so that what happens today or what happens tomorrow, you have a tool bag, you have a methodology to approach whatever happens with some tools in your belt. I tell people that I thought I understood what resiliency was 100 years ago when I went through a divorce. But I discovered resiliency at another level when I lost my daughter, who died suddenly. And then my mom died a few weeks later. And those skills, that didn't mean I didn't feel it. That didn't mean I wasn't miserable during those times. But I knew there was a process that I had in place so that I knew eventually I would be back on my game. And that's what resiliency is. And that's what extreme self-care is. It means going deeper, doing more than your regular. Now, more doesn't mean difficult, expensive, fancy, or take a lot of time. What that means is if you add 1% more, it's still more. The theory I used of the 1%, I developed when I was teaching university. I was a professor, and I had students that were coming in who had never really achieved anything and were, first year Latino with no support. And they said, we don't know how to do this, and we're getting C's and D's, and we're not going to get. And I said, well, you can't go from a D to an A immediately. Add 1% more to what you're doing, and you can go from a D to a D plus, and from a D plus to a C minus, and from a C minus to a C. Over a period of time, you're going to get there. And the majority of those students had never heard that idea that 1% is more. And joyfully, the majority of my students now have graduate degrees because they figured out how to do that. I figured out how to do that myself, which is why I taught it. I went from being on welfare and public assistance and no education to having several advanced degrees, a PhD, because I just kept on adding a little bit more until I got where I needed to be. So self-care is the same thing. It's not magical. Whatever you're doing now on a regular basis, physically, emotionally, spiritually, or mentally, that's keeping you going, add 1% more on a regular basis, and you're going to be much stronger. It's kind of like people talk about doing yoga. You stretch once and then you stretch a little bit more and stretch a little bit more until you're flexible. So 1% things can mean a lot, but they don't have to be big. Read one book, doodle in a color book till you feel like you're doing some art. Listen to a Calm app. Take a short walk. Practice. If you practice yoga a little more. Instead of 20 minutes, practice 22 minutes. Listen to music, sing or dance, whatever it's going to take to add a little bit more to what you're doing without it hurting, without it being an addition to your pandemic or your volcano fatigue. Add a little bit more to what you're doing so that you build a sturdy foundation. You build the muscles of resiliency. So physically, take one more breath. You don't have to sit and meditate for 4 hours. Just take a deep breath. Relax your jaw. Go out and look at the trees. Listen to some music. Smell some plumeria. In other words, add a little bit more to the fact that you're in a physical body, and your body will respond to that with a little bit more resiliency. Mentally or cognitively, do something a little bit different. If you're always reading romance novels, watch the Discovery Channel once in a while. Write in a journal. If you always read People magazine, read National Geographic. If you also always, are serious, well, read a People magazine and find out what the stars are doing this week. In other words, stretch and expand how you are in the world with your mind. Emotionally, it's important to know your own emotional temperature. If you're a person that often gets angry, know what your numbers are, 0 to 10, and know where you are so you can adjust your numbers up or down. If you're sad, at a 9, maybe you can adjust down to an 8.5 by taking your happiness up 0.5. In other words, these things, these moods, these feelings, these experiences emotionally can be fluid if you know yourself really well. If you know what's important to you and know how to be in your own experience. Look for the stress warning signs. Stress is difficult. Look for them emotionally, cognitively, work related. In other words, you can go on Google right now and look up stress warning signs and find out where you are and start knowing what your level of stress is so that you can know where you are, know when you need to get support, and know how to communicate it to others. To say to someone, I'm stressed, is different than saying, I was at a 5 this morning and now I'm at a 7. I just need to take a break. In disasters, there are things that I call rabbit holes. And those rabbit holes are when you lose track of yourself. You lose track of your emotions, your spirit, your body, and things start getting away from you. Relationships start changing. You start drinking or using drugs more than you have in the past or more than ever. And you start losing track of your stability, of your sense of self. So to avoid those rabbit holes, you have to think about, how many disasters have you already had? Where are you today? And that it's okay not to feel okay. Emotions are a normal part of experiencing something abnormal. And what a disaster is, it's something abnormal. It's an experience that you either have had before, so it stirred it all up, or it's a new experience for you and you have no clue of how to deal with it. So the feelings you may be having, I always say, they're okay. If you're at a 10 all the time, you need to reach out for some support. But to have a 10 once in a while during a disaster is really a reasonable response. But you need to know yourself. And what that means is know yourself physically, add that 1%. Emotionally, know yourself emotionally, add that 1% of support, of awareness of yourself. Or spiritually, whatever your practice is, lean deeper into your spiritual practice. Whatever you need to do about that with intention and mindfulness, add 1% to that. My favorite 1% is making art. One of my degrees is in art therapy. And so any kind of I've done the research and I know that any kind of creative activity significantly lessens the stress in your body. And you don't need to be an artist. One of the things I teach is sit in front of the TV, watch a football game or whatever it is you do in the evening with a sketch pad and just doodle. Don't make pictures of flowers unless you want to, flowers and trees, but just move your hand around on the paper. You can color it in if you want. But that movement, research has shown just drawing on paper for 10 to 15 minutes a day changes and supports your immune system. So again, this is a way that's kind of spiritual and emotional and mental and physical. Just doing some doodling can help your resiliency over time. I also tell people that if you're a person that doodles during a meeting, be sure you doodle during a meeting. And if anybody gives you grief about it, tell them that Dr. Vali said it's okay for you to doodle during a meeting. It's good for your immune system. So you find your way through the process. And if you don't know how to do that, there are tons of resources available. One free resource for you is to go on one of my websites, which is www.eapacific.com, and you can sign up for a book I wrote called 52 Weeks of Wellbeing. And what you'll get for that is every week for 52 weeks, you'll get a reminder about resiliency and how to increase your resiliency, a little meditation or a meaningful project, a little art doodle thing that you can look at. And you can do that for fun. You can give that to your team. It's free. There's no obligation. You can sign up for that, and you can print out the art project and have people do it as a project or as a contest, or for incentivizing people. We also have a couple other projects on there you can look at. But this is a resiliency tool that allows you once a week to go, oh, that's right, I'm working on my resiliency. Oh, that's right, I can just doodle. I can do this little art project. I can do this coloring project. It's important that you become mindful about what you're doing to take care of yourself. Your feelings matter, but unfortunately, your feelings matter most of yourself. So if you don't take care of yourself, who's going to? One of the things I like to say is, if you're not in your game, there's no game. I have trainings on mindfulness and awareness and resiliency, dozens of trainings. This is just a little quick dose to consider resiliency and extreme self-care. So reviewing, resiliency is a practice that you develop for yourself, which is your stress management toolkit. And extreme self-care is adding that 1% of what you already do to take care of yourself, adding a little bit more over the long haul to get through whatever your life needs. Life happens, whether we're prepared for it or not, life happens, and we either have the tools and equipment for it or we don't. One of the things I have done professionally is prepared cities with the idea of go bags, emergency preparation for disasters. And most of us who live here know that, we're going to get that go bag, we're going to get our hurricane food, and we get to it or we don't. And there's people that are on top of that, like obsessively, and there's people that don't do it at all, the 0 to 10 people. But what I suggest is that before hurricane season, for example, every time you get groceries, you get one extra item for 69 cents or $1. That doesn't overburden the system. See, that's that bounded optimism place where you're not freaking out because we might have a hurricane, and you're not going, oh, we'll never have a hurricane here. It's that middle ground that says, I'm going to do a little bit more to make sure that I'm okay. So that's what resiliency is. And if you're interested in some other projects I have, you're welcome to look at my website. But we're all in this together is not just a phrase that makes a good bumper sticker. We're all in this together, meaning we're human beings having human experiences, and disasters, whether they're small or large, are part of our human experience. And everyone experiences them the way they do. People will ask me, well, what counts? What's big enough? And I say, if you have if you have a paper cut and that's the worst experience you've ever had, that's your 10. If you have an amputation, that's your 10, if that's the worst thing that's happened to you. I have people come in and they've broken up with their boyfriend for the first time, and they go, well, I know this isn't important. And I go, it is important. If it's the worst thing that's ever experienced to you, it matters, and it matters to you. So let's see what we can do to help you develop your resiliency so that the next 10 you have some more tools. So that's my quick tips for you today. I hope this has been helpful, and I'm very glad to be part of this to support Pune. And I know there's a lot going on in a lot of corners, and I appreciate how hard it can be from day to day. So thank you, and thanks, Keith, for inviting me.